how did I make this DIY kitchen toddler stool? Join me and I'll explain some of the processes that I used and the tools that I used in order to make it. So first of all, I had to find a design. I looked up online a bunch of different toddler stools and I finally settled on this one. I felt like it was the most sturdy and it was something that I can build. So first thing I went to was some measurements, and for this I love keeping notes on index cards, and I'll show some of my designs here for you. So I measured the countertop first. It was 36 inches tall. I went back and realized I wanted it to fit under the bull nose granite countertop I have, so I changed it to 34.5 inches tall. Next I wanted to figure out how high the stool would be that Sky is standing on, and I figured it should be the counter should come up to about her belly. So I measured from the floor to her belly button. That was quite comical to try to get that measurement, but it was fun, and it ended up being about 18 inches. So I knew how high I wanted the middle platform to be that she would be mainly standing on. Next I settled on 18 inches wide. That was kind of an arbitrary number, but it seemed to work out well. And lastly, I wanted it to be 12 inches deep. As we get into the video later, I'll explain that ended up actually being 11 inches deep, and that's due to the limitations on the wood that I was actually buying. So this next sketch is a rough SketchUp that I did for all the dimensions. You can see it's kind of all over the place. I don't have any official dimensions that I planned out or wrote down, but you can see here kind of a little original design of what I was planning to do. When you make all these dimensions and you're planning out all these cuts and these boards, if you notice at the top, I did a quick calculation for how many boards is going to be on each stool. 7 plus 7 are the boards that are on the side, and then 3 are the 3 boards that are in the middle connecting it all, for a total of 17 different boards per stool. On this next index card, I wrote out all the boards that are needed. All the boards are 4 inches wide with the exception of the platforms that Sky stands on, and those ended up being 11-inch boards. So you can see I just needed a count of how many different boards of each specific size that I would actually need. And finally, on this last index card, I planned out all of my cuts. This is important. That way you aren't wasting wood, and you know exactly what you're doing once you buy the wood, how you're going to cut it, and at what lengths you need each board to be at. So now I wanted to just give a quick rundown on all the tools that I used. There are quite a few tools. I printed out a list, so I'm just going to read them off here for you. I used the table saw and miter saw. Those are 2 staples in any wood shop. The table saw you're going to use to make your long cuts along the board, and the miter saw you'll use for all the short cuts. I used a jigsaw to make the rounded edges on the very top piece. 2 drills. One of them has a countersink drill bit in it. You could do it with 1 drill, but it's so much faster if you have 2 drills. I used a brad nail gun, which we'll get into later. That really saved my butt. A bunch of 1 1/4 inch screws. I used my pocket hole jig as well as pocket screws. Obviously measuring devices, your tape measure and other things like that. I used a lot of clamps. Not all of them are even shown on this picture because you can never have enough clamps. That's kind of just a rule of a wood shop, really. I have the paint that I used, which was a white primer paint, and then I have pink and blue since I was making 2 stools. And lastly, I have my router. This is a tool that I bought specifically for this project, and I'm so glad that I did it. It really takes your woodworking when you're making things, it takes it to the next level. And all the router does is when you have a piece of wood, it comes to a 90-degree point. The router will actually make that point or the edge of the wood rounded. So when she's grabbing it, moving it around, anything like that, it will be on a rounded edge instead of like the hard, sharp edge. That tool, absolutely amazing. I'm so glad that I got it. And it's just a rigid cordless router. So now I'm going to explain how I built it. Now that I had my wood that I got from Home Depot, I used my table saw to make all the long cuts, make sure that the boards were all 4 inches wide and the appropriate length that I needed. Next, I used my miter saw to do the shortcuts on the boards, and you saw on the index cards all the lengths that I needed for that. Once I had all of the cuts done, I decided to use this opportunity to use the router and round off a lot of the edges that I knew would need to be rounded and that weren't really going to be possible to route those once it was built. Things like this are the platforms that Sky is standing on. Both of those platforms and a lot of the long boards, the 4 long boards that are going on the side. I built the standing platforms first. The middle platform is pretty much standalone, so that was really easy to build. It was just 3 pieces of wood and I used pocket hole screws. It was very easy to do. After that, I built the bottom stand. The bottom stand was a little bit more tricky because this is an actual perfect 90-degree angle that you needed to have these connected on. So there was some leveling and balance involved there, but again, it really wasn't all that hard to do. Next, I attached the 4 long pieces to the very bottom base, and this was very important to make sure that they are all level, and this would be controlling the balance of everything. So I clamped them down well and ended up screwing those together with the 1 1/4 inch screws. After that, I ended up putting on the middle platform and attached that. Again, you want to make sure that it's as level as possible, and that was pretty easy to do again with the screws. Once you have everything in place, you could clamp it down, you can make sure everything's level, and then that was done. Lastly, I put together the 3 top pieces. The 2 side pieces were very easy to do, and the top rounded piece, I used pocket hole screws to attach that. That way we didn't see screws drilled in from the front or on the side of the unit. I just felt like it would make it a lot cleaner if I did it that way, and it worked out really well. Now, after it was built, I realized that this was not leveled correctly. And what I ended up doing, I was going to so learn from my mistakes. I thought I could just sand down the bottom of each of the legs until it was level. Well, I tried sanding it, and you would need some pretty hardcore sandpaper in order to take enough off to actually level the whole thing out. So I ended up cutting out a really small piece of wood and gluing and putting it on the bottom, and I have an image of that here that you can see. My first try at it was I tried to drill a screw into it, and since the piece of wood is so small, it split it right open. And I was like, well, great, I'm gonna make another one. So I made another little piece of wood to balance it, and I tried screwing it again. Don't ask me why. I tried the same thing again, and it split again. So thank God I had a brad nail gun. I actually bought the brad nail gun a couple years ago when I was building Sky's nursery for the chair rails that I put up in her room. So I tried it a 3rd time with the brad nail gun, and it worked out absolutely perfect. And once that was in place, everything was level. There was very little movement when I put pressure on it, so when Sky's standing on it, it's not wobbling around. So learn from my mistakes. Brad nail gun or something like that when you're attaching a very small piece or thin piece of wood. Lastly, after it's built, it was painting. I did the white primer first, and then I did the one coat of paint and then a second coat of paint. All the painting was done in 6 different sessions. Basically, I did the white primer with the stool standing up. I painted everything that I could. I waited 24 hours, then I flipped it over and I painted all the bottom of it on both stools. And then the next session I did was first coat of paint. Again, the stool was standing up. I waited 24 hours. I flipped it over, painted the bottom part of it, and rinse and repeat for the second coat of paint as well. All in all, painting actually took me a while. It was probably at least 6 hours of painting, just because there's a lot of nooks and crannies and other areas that were kind of hard to get into, and I wanted to make sure that it looked good and I didn't have too many runny spots in there. And I also wanted a thick coat of paint on there. So it did take a little bit longer, but I think the 2 coats of paint and the thicker paint kind of just really getting it on there will help the durability and the lastability of the stool. Since it's in the kitchen, I'm sure it's going to get spilled on, beat up, all kinds of things. And I wanted it to be something that would last pretty well. So that's pretty much it on everything that I did to build it. Now let's have some fun and see some photos of Sky and her cousin Zach in the stools and how it turned out. Season the meat.
Thank you.
Good job, Sky. Put on the lid. That's red pepper. It's spicy.
I know you want to do more. Just put some more in there.
I want to do some more. Okay, bring it over for me, Mom. Okay. Right.
Shake it. Can you shake it?
Good job.
All done.
Well done. Thank you, Sky.
Thank you. Well done. You gonna have fun with this over here?
Sky. Good job. You helping?
Put it in the kitchen. We're gonna have some saturated meat in the middle with that seasoning, but that's fine. Making some tacos.
And lastly, I wanted to go over some mistakes that I made and maybe some tips for anyone who decides to maybe try to make this. So the first thing is the middle leg. There's actually 6 points that are touching the ground, and the middle leg just does not need to touch the ground. At first I thought I was doing it for added stability, and I guess that may be the case, but it's really just not needed, and it makes it a lot more difficult to balance everything. So I would actually bring that up just a few inches so that it's in line with the bottom base of the actual stool, and that way you just eliminate that extra balancing part of it. I still think it would actually look pretty neat if it was raised up and not all the way to the ground. So that would be one change that I would do. The second thing is I would paint first before I built it. I would lay out all the pieces and I would paint all of them with the white primer paint and both coats of paint before I built it. After it's built, if I wanted to, I can go in there and do some touch-up work on it. That would be really easy, but I think if I did this again, I would definitely paint first before I actually built it. The top bar, this is the third thing. The top bar of the stool was actually originally supposed to be on the front face instead of between both the sides. And I cut it wrong initially, and I didn't have enough spare wood to cut it again. So I decided to just put it right on the inside. If I did it again, I would take that top piece and I would make it a little bit longer so that it fit on the front of the stool. This way you get an extra 3/4 of an inch of room for whoever is standing on it. And I think it's a little narrow, and 1/4 of an inch doesn't sound, or excuse me, 3/4 of an inch doesn't sound all that much like a difference, but I think it would add up, as well as the base. Since I bought the wood, it came in for the stand, it came in 11 inches and 1/4. So I ended up making the base that she stands on 11 inches. I think I would probably try to get a wider board, maybe something 16 inches or maybe even a little bit wider if I could, and I would cut it down to a 12-inch base. With a 12-inch base and moving that top rounded part to the outside, it would free up another 1 3/4 inch, and I think that would be a good amount of size for them to stand on. A little bit more breathing room and easier for them to get in and out of the stool. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer them. Take care.